Right. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm Jackie Croslin with KEDC Grants, and I see a lot of you, a lot of familiar faces on here. And today I'm really excited to get to be a part of this day. We have Blair Hess with us today, and I want to tell you a little bit about her. She's a seventh generation Kentuckian. Once I read that, I thought, what am I? I have no idea. So now I need to find out. She grew up traveling and learning about the state with her family. She's the co-author of 4 books about Kentucky travel, culture, food, and history, and she travels the state promoting and teaching others about the Commonwealth. Blair is a graduate of University of Kentucky and Kentucky State University and works as a communications professional in Lexington. She lives in Frankfort with her daughter and husband. So Blair, we are very excited to have you here with us today. And you all, as normal, please feel free to ask questions, especially in the chat box, or if there's time, you can unmute and ask questions as well. And thank you for being here. And I'll turn it over to you, Blair.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me. I'm going to share a PowerPoint here. And as soon as I do that, I kind of lose the Zoom window a little bit. So feel free to verbally stop me if you need anything. You're welcome to interrupt me or whatever you need to do. I guess I'll share my screen before I lose the Zoom window entirely. All right. I feel like I say the same script all the time on these, like, can you all see everything?
I can see the presenter's view.
Yeah, I'm going to flip it over, I think.
Oh, gotcha.
If I remember how.
Oh, there it is. Swap display.
Did it work?
Yes, it did work. I love it.
Perfect. You all don't need to see all my messy notes in the background. That's no fun for anybody. Well, once again, thank you so much for having me. It was a great introduction. I won't waste too much time talking about me. Are you all still there?
Yes, we're here.
Sorry, froze for a second. I get the job of traveling across the state and promoting the Commonwealth to people. I started doing this in 2010, but I grew up traveling the state with my family. We were a family who, when we went on vacation for spring break or we had summer break, we went to Mammoth Cave. We went to Cumberland Falls. We got out in our backyard, and it didn't occur to me until high school and really college that many of my fellow Kentuckians did not do that with their families. I met a lot of people who knew nothing about the state. I met a lot of people who I felt I was sharing some sort of secret Jeopardy trivia with, when really it was just stuff I thought everyone should know about the state. We learn a lot about Kentucky at school, but it's so much about the history, and it's not so much about how we can take part in that and things we can get out and see. So it became a passion project of mine, and a friend of mine and I started writing travel guides in 2013. We've now published 4 of them, and we have a 5th that we're fingers crossed we'll have out next year. But in that adventure, something I get to do is travel across and talk about Kentucky in a way that I hope is relatable and something that you all can be involved with. I have things listed here about me, and the things that I don't have here that I think is really important to say are the things that I'm not. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a historian. I'm not a linguist. Everything that I know about Kentucky is well researched, and definitely from experiences traveling and learning from Kentuckians. But my approach to this is to get people excited about Kentucky, and to get people involved in what we're doing and proud of where they come from, or proud of where they're living right now. I don't envy your all's job. I come from a family of educators, and in November, I was invited to come to Northern Kentucky to talk to a 5th grade class about Kentucky. And they were so polite and so involved in the conversation. I was so terrified that I was going to be there and they were just going to be giving me glass-eyed expressions and not care anything about what I was talking about. It was the opposite. They were so involved and absolutely terrifying. I think it was probably the scariest experience of my life. If anything, it helped me do this because I now have a little bit less fright of getting up in front of people and talking, because if you can take the drilling of 5th graders, you can take the drilling of pretty much anyone. We talked a lot about chickens, not necessarily as an ag export or the Kentucky fried kind, just chickens in general, backyard, what I would name my chickens, all of those things. I genuinely don't, I left that day both impressed by their knowledge and terrified I didn't teach them anything. And then I talked to the teacher afterwards and she was like, they loved it. It was great. And I thought, okay, great. Good to know. So I say all that to tell you that, I hope that you take away something about this, about these Kentucky heroes and these people who I consider extremely influential in our state. But I also hope that you take it to mean just get out and explore and learn about Kentucky. It was the best thing that I could have done, and I'm so happy to get people involved. I have the last bullet point there that says married to a professional photographer, not because I think you all need to know that, but a lot of his photos will appear in this slide deck, and I don't want him to invoice me. So I want to make sure that I say now that he took several of these photos, not the historic ones. I think you'll know the difference. And I'm super grateful that I can just pull from his archive. Now I have a super, super ambitious schedule today. We'll see how much I can roll through. I think you can tell already I talk really fast. So hopefully I talk fast enough that we can get this. I'm also going to hit some pretty high level stuff about these people. I want you all to kind of be introduced to them. Many of them will be very familiar faces. But at the heart of what I'm doing, I want to talk about what to me that makes them a hero. And, in my thought here, it's, these are individuals who took tremendous personal risks in order to benefit millions of people, including us. And so I want to talk a little bit about all of them in these different categories. I'm not going to cover everyone. I'll even tell you as we go along, oh my gosh, I didn't include this person and this person, and you all know they're important. But I want you all to know that, just because they're not here, they're not in my mind. It's just, I wanted to hit some that were the stories I love and the stories I love to share with people. These words here, tomorrow, the land where we will live, is the translation of the word Kentucky. There's lots of other versions of what people think Kentucky means. There's a terrible, bloody version that comes from Cherokee, but this is when Kentucky was named with the Native American tribes that were living here. This is a translation of the word as we understand it. And I think that really speaks to kind of my inspiration behind getting to know my state and teaching others about my state. But I also want to start with this in mind as a disclaimer that the people that I'm going to talk about when I talk about explorers and pioneers, what I really mean is the first white men. And I think that that's really important to say because for a very long time, nearly 200 years, a lot of historians argue that Native Americans didn't live in Kentucky, that they actually passed through here, that they would hunt and gather through here. But we have a lot of archaeological evidence now that disproves that. And we know that Kentucky tribes did live here. In fact, when Kentucky joined the Union, there were more than 20 tribes occupying land that we now know as Kentucky. So knowing that Cherokee and Chickasaw and Chippewa and Delaware and Miami, and I can't remember them all or properly pronounce them all, we're here. I want to make sure you all know that I know that and I respect that. And what we're talking about here is the first white settlers and the first people to kind of bring the new wave of living from the New World. So we'll start with explorers and pioneers. And one of the coolest things that I like to think about when I think about the earliest days of Kentucky is imagine it on a timeline and imagining that, when the first white men came across the Atlantic and came to the New World, it took 160 years for Americans to get from the Atlantic coast across the Appalachian Mountains. 160 years. And really, in the grand scheme of time, that's not a whole lot, right? I mean, it's not that crazy. But from the time that they landed to the time they crossed through the Cumberland Gap, 160 years, and that's a distance of a couple hundred miles. In the next 70 years, they would explore 3,000 miles from coast to coast. And really, it was Daniel Boone who was able to break that chain that confined everybody east of the Appalachian Mountains. And so when I start to talk about Daniel Boone, we often hear that he was the founder of Kentucky. He settled it, which is, part true, part not true. He was certainly not the first white man into the state. But he was the first to break that chain that really confined people to the East Coast. And when we think about it, we don't think of Kentucky as the West by any means today. But when Kentucky became a state, it was the first state west of the Appalachian Mountains. And for a long time, it really was the Wild West. So I like to kind of set that stage and that timeline for everyone to think about as we start to talk. I want to talk mainly about Thomas Walker and Daniel Boone. There were many other people in the state of Kentucky who helped found it, many other explorers and surveyors that helped get us where we are. But these two really were hugely instrumental in just getting us here. This painting here, I think is really interesting. This depicts Daniel Boone here in front, bringing the first group of settlers in. So Dr. Thomas Walker was the first person to explore Kentucky in 1750 and again in 1751. But it was Daniel Boone who brought people with him, people who were not, there to explore and there to discover the new world, but actually to settle there. But Thomas Walker came in 1750. He was native of Virginia. He was a physician and a planter, and then later in his life became an explorer. He founded the Loyal Land Company in 1749, and he was actually granted 800,000 acres by the royal government to have this land that at that time was just over the Appalachian Mountains and is now southeastern Kentucky. So he didn't come here totally blind. He knew that there was land here for him, that he could come and settle it. And he crossed in 1750 and he built the first non-Indian house in Kentucky. You can actually go to Barberville and visit a replica of this cabin. It's a nice park. You can camp. They have tours of the cabin. I laughed when I arrived in Barberville to do this tour, and she said, "I'm here to give you the tour." And I was like, it's smaller than my closet. I don't know how to say that I'm going to get a tour of this place, but I love that that's what you're going to do. But it's very educational. I always encourage people to go to state parks because there's so many great people working there and so educational. But you can see kind of roughly the area where this first cabin was built. And it's a good trip to take and learn. But when he first explored this land, he was 19 years before Daniel Boone got here. So we're talking about Daniel Boone, the first people to kind of cross what he named later the Wilderness Road and come through the Cumberland Gap. But we forget that it was actually Dr. Thomas Walker who named the Cumberland Gap. He built that cabin along a river that he named the Cumberland River, and he established this space that we would pass through, called the Cumberland Gap. He named the Cumberland Gap for Prince William, which was he was the Duke of Cumberland, and he was the son of King George. But Thomas Walker's expedition brought attention to this pass in the mountains. So obviously the first people to use this pass were Native Americans and likely buffalo before them. But the pass was 300 feet off the ground, off of sea level, compared to the highest peaks next to that pass being over 2,500 feet tall. So it's hard sometimes to think about the impact of what the Cumberland Gap gave to settlers coming into Kentucky. We think of it now. I know in this last slide, there's a picture there of how it just is like a subtle dip in the mountains and doesn't seem along the Appalachian Mountains. We now know there are lots of passes. We, can blast our way through. We make even more now. But if you think about climbing a hill that was 300 feet as opposed to climbing a hill that was 2,500 feet, you can see how it really laid the groundwork for how we were able to pass into this new land and settle things. Now, Daniel Boone, I do want to give the proper credit to Dr. Walker and the early surveyors that came with him, but it was Daniel Boone that really established the settlement that we now think about Kentucky. He was native of Pennsylvania, and he was a hunter and he was a trapper, and he came over, he settled in North Carolina with his family, and he first started his first expeditions into Kentucky in 1773. His idea was Western expansion the whole time, and so he started coming across. He didn't have a lot of formal schooling, but as a hunter and trapper, he knew a lot of information about how to survive in the wilderness. And so he went through a couple of times in 1773, again in 1775. And then he decided that he was going to bring his family along with him and settle. Now, the first expeditions of Daniel Boone were not what I would consider successful. I don't know that it was what he would consider successful. They were met with Native American tribes. They met conflict. In fact, his son was captured and tortured and killed, and they ended up turning back and returning to North Carolina not long after. But they did eventually come through, and they settled Boonesboro and really set up the success of towns like Harrodstown, which became Harrodsburg, and allowed for settlements. Daniel Boone did not ever really become what we would call successful. He was a surveyor. He did fight in the American Revolution, and he died later in Missouri. But he was never a wealthy man. He claimed a lot of lands, but never necessarily collected on it. But he's certainly a figure that we can credit a lot of Western settlement with. Not far from where I live in Frankfurt, there is a lovely headstone dedicated to Daniel Boone, where he is buried at the Frankfurt Cemetery. But if you visit, you'll find a lot of folks who tell you he's not actually there. There is a little bit of a debate as to whether or not he's buried here in Kentucky, or if he is buried in Missouri, where he died. Of course, I'm here to tell you the Kentucky version of this, so I'm going to tell you he's buried right over here. But I will give you the side note in case folks ask you that he may or may not also be buried in Missouri. I'm going to take a breath and see if anyone has questions so far before I move into probably my favorite part.
When I looked at the chat box, I have to admit I kind of lost it for a minute, but
No, you're fine.
I don't see any questions. Anybody have anything before we move forward?
All right, I'm going to continue at breakneck pace then. So scientists and inventors are my favorite part about talking about Kentucky. I love to challenge people, especially those who are maybe less than proud of where they live and come from. Kentucky is sometimes known as, for things like bad teeth and no shoes and kind of a hillbilly reputation that anyone who actually lives here or meets the people knows is not true. And so I like to always tell people, the high five was invented in Kentucky. There's a former U of L basketball player named Wiley Brown who claims he invented the high five. We have all kinds of claims to fame that I love about this state. And so they're always my favorite part to talk about because I just find them so interesting. So I'm not going to cover everything, obviously, as my disclaimer, but I do want to talk about some of my favorite Kentucky inventions and the people behind them and why I consider them to be so important in our history. The first up is James Bowie, and I'm going to tell you it's James Bowie. I have forever pronounced it as Bowie, and I have been corrected many, many times. But it is pronounced Bowie, and I will remind myself every time as I say it. And of course, if you guys recognize that name, it's due to his famous Bowie knife. It became famous when he used it, when he wielded it during the Alamo fight during the Texas Revolution. And it was this really unique, weird, curved, long knife. And this knife to the native of Logan County, Kentucky, he said it was given to him by his brother Resin. Now, there's a little bit of a debate here whether or not Resin actually invented the knife. He claims he did, that he designed it, and he had a blacksmith actually build it, but the blacksmith never spoke up and never said whether it was one way or the other. Resin's own grandchildren say it was the blacksmith's design, and Jim Bowie did eventually say that he did believe that the blacksmith, whose last name was Snowden, was actually the person who designed the knife. But he made it famous, and we along with the Tommy gun can claim that as Kentucky things. That is also not a picture of James Bowie, by the way. That's Thomas Morgan. I haven't gotten to him yet. I realized as I was talking, it probably looked like it was him. One of my very favorite Kentucky inventions was invented by John Hilrick, which I always, again, pronounce that name wrong. I like to remind myself as I go through these. Perhaps one of our most famous inventions in Kentucky is the Louisville Slugger, and which was invented by John Hilrick and his father. His father was a German immigrant who opened a woodworking shop in Louisville in 1855. And Bud used to work in the woodworking shop with his father. And he always told the story when he was a kid that he used to sneak out and he used to go to baseball games whenever he could get away with it. And one night when he was at a local baseball game, he was watching one of the players and they struck out and they took the baseball bat and they did the famous break over the knee, right? And snapped the baseball bat in half and threw it off to the side. And so after the game, Bud ran up to this baseball player and he said, "If you come back to my father's woodworking shop with me, I will make you a new baseball bat. We'll make you a bat and we can measure it to your specifications and you're going to hit a home run every time." So he took him back to his father's shop and they made him a bat, and that player was Pete Browning, who played for the Louisville Eclipse. And the next game, Pete Browning took the bat to the game and he proceeded to have 3 hits in that game. And so they named the baseball bat after Pete Browning, who was called at the time the Louisville Slugger. Now, of course, the Louisville Slugger has now been the bat of choice from Major League Baseball players for years and years, and every baseball team beneath that level. It was actually Pittsburgh Pirate baseball player Honus Wagner who signed the first paid endorsement deal with Louisville Slugger. But I always tell people, I promise that if I recommend a museum or an experience to you, it's because I've done it and I've enjoyed it. The Louisville Slugger Museum is absolutely fascinating. I have been, I don't even know how many times. It's one I never say no to. I take visitors there. I absolutely love to go on that tour, and it never gets old. So I highly encourage you, if you're in Louisville, to tour that museum. Another favorite invention of mine is by Garrett Morgan. So Garrett Morgan was extremely trailblazing for African-American inventors. He holds several patents. He was born in Paris, Kentucky in 1877, and he only had no elementary school education. But he began his career as a sewing machine mechanic, and he really honed his mechanical brain in learning how parts of machinery worked. And so Garrett began with inventing a sewing machine, like a little bit tweaked sewing machine, and he got his first patent in this sort of modified version. And then he went on. In 1914, he patented a breathing device. It was more like a safety hood, but it was the blueprint for the modern day gas mask. And in fact, they used Morgan's design to develop the blueprint for what was used in World War I as all the gas masks. But it wasn't super easy to be Morgan. So he is an African-American man in the early 1900s, and he can't even get fire departments to invest in his gas mask. So it wasn't exactly an easy road, but it didn't stop him by any means. Perhaps more famous than his gas mask was his next invention, which is what we know as the modern day traffic signal. He was the first Black man in Cleveland, Ohio to own a car. And so while he was driving that car, he actually invented the friction drive clutch. And as part of that, he realized that through that clutch, it took people a little bit longer to stop. And so he watched carriages and vehicles with motors have trouble at different intersections. And so he invented a traffic signal that had a warning light that would alert drivers from far away that they needed to stop. And so he patented a very rudimentary version of what is now the modern three-way traffic light, and they installed the first one in Cleveland. Now, my favorite part, I was telling that story to a group in Paris, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards, and he said he worked for General Electric for many years, and it was actually GE who had bought the rights to that traffic light from Garrett Morgan, and he sold it for $40,000. And I just had this moment of like, oh my God, how many traffic lights in all the world? And the man sold the patent for $40,000, which is just, of course he did. Moving on quickly, and I'm sorry, I'm going so quickly through them. I want to get all this in as much as I can. Mildred and Patty Hill, I wanted to put in this for this group in particular because they were school teachers. In fact, they weren't just school teachers, they were pretty pioneering for early childhood education. Patty eventually became principal of a demonstration kindergarten in Louisville. And it was when she was principal of that school that she realized that the songs and things being taught to the students, whether to learn lessons or just in music class, were not easy to follow or to learn. And so they didn't really understand them, and she thought she might have a better luck. She wrote lots and lots of songs that she ended up using in her classroom. Now, Mildred was also a teacher, and she was really passionate about advocating for African-American music, and she thought the influence of African-American music was great. And so a lot of that came through in her songwriting as well. But they wrote a song called Good Morning to You, and it was the different lyrics, but the same tune as Happy Birthday to You. So they eventually evolved a little bit. And now they have the song Happy Birthday to You, which was also now invented in Kentucky. I have two more on this list, and I could talk about these people forever and ever. Thomas Hunt Morgan and Philip A. Sharp, I put together. They're many years apart. Thomas Hunt Morgan, 1933, Philip A. Sharp in 1993, but they are the two Nobel Peace Prize winners from Kentucky. Both of them, coincidentally, though that much time apart, won their Nobel Prizes for their work in genetics. Thomas Hunt Morgan was hugely influential in learning about how how genes duplicate in a way that makes us understand hereditary genes. He did a lot of his experimenting with flies and their eye color and helped us understand modern day genetics and how eye color can be passed. Very similarly, Philip A. Sharp used a lot of Thomas Hunt Morgan's notes and writings. He actually discovered split genes. And so he's been instrumental in cancer research and some other things. So I think that much time apart, still so close in what they were doing. To close out this section, I think it probably surprises you to have Abraham Lincoln on this list and maybe not a different list. And I will talk about him a little bit in our next part. But I do want to note that he was an inventor himself. Abraham Lincoln is the only US president to have a patent. He patented a boat, which I have included in that last slide. There's a model there at the bottom of that boat. But it was basically a way to get boats over parts of the river that were not navigable. So his experience growing up in Kentucky, in Illinois, in those areas where they had lots of water that was navigable, but also lots of shallow, rocky water. He invented a system for these fabric bladders that were waterproof that would go under the boat. And so when you got to a part where the boat was stuck, you could inflate the boat and it would lift it like on the surface of the water and it could float over the shallow water. So he actually has that patent still. He's the only president now. He went on to patent several other items during his presidency, but none of them were actually applicable and usable. The bladders for the boat were the only part that were ever actually adapted. We doing okay so far? Everyone hanging in there?
Yes, I think it's going really well and very fascinating.
Well, good. The sad part about trying to fit so many people in is I feel like I have to glaze on over them. So I just hope I spark interest enough to get you all to want to dig in deeper. This is a hard section because there's so many great politicians from Kentucky, and I could spend a lot of time talking just about our 16th president. I don't even include Henry Clay in this part. He was an incredibly influential statesman and a big inspiration to Abraham Lincoln. I wanted to do a balance of, kind of historic politicians, but also modern day social leaders. And frankly, it's just impossible to cover all the influence. What I think is fascinating about Kentucky and what I continue to come back to is perhaps it's its position as one of the, first Western states. Perhaps it's its position centrally located, but so many great minds come out of the state. And I think that is something that is not often talked about. But even whether it's inventions of stoplights or Bowie knives, or whether it's great politicians or entertainers that come from Kentucky, a lot more famous people, if you just type in a Google search bar, famous people from Kentucky, you'll be overwhelmed with the number of people throughout history. One of the more fascinating things I find, and I don't include him on a list here of heroes of Kentucky for many reasons, but both presidents during the Civil War, both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, were born in Kentucky, and they were born about 70 miles from one another. Lincoln was born in Hodgensville, Jefferson Davis was born in Falmouth, and I just find it so fascinating that Kentucky breeds these types of leaders. And I don't mean one way good or one way bad. I just mean that the gene, that the inheritance of the desire to be a leader, to be impactful, to make change, comes out of these people who are from here, whose families are from here. And so I don't include Jefferson Davis on my hero list for many reasons, but I do think it's interesting that two people can be born 70 miles from one another. One, as a child, moves north to Illinois and grows up and becomes president of the Union. One, as a boy, moves south to Louisiana and becomes president of a whole different ideal. Very different, very impactful in different ways, but this list is definitely not comprehensive of all the politicians and social leaders. I mentioned, obviously, our 16th president, most famous for being president during that time during our history, for his work on the Emancipation Proclamation, his very famous Gettysburg Address. But he was born in LaRue County to Thomas and Nancy Lincoln. Thomas and Nancy Lincoln were Kentuckians and had been here a while. He had moved to Kentucky. Thomas Lincoln had moved to Kentucky in 1792, which was not very long after Daniel Boone first came to Kentucky. He bought 340 acres in LaRue County on Sinking Springs Farm, which if you've ever visited the Lincoln Homestead, You can see the spring that the farm is named after. It's a great trip. I recommend going. But it was 348 acres, $200, and that's where Lincoln was born. And sometimes when I'm there, I think about, what it would be like as a parent to live in this small cabin and this farm in the middle of Kentucky and think, oh, well, of course my son's going to grow up and be president of the United States. If you visit, you literally right down the road, you actually see the location where he was born. And the homestead area on Sinking Springs is where they moved shortly after. So I recommend going to both places. It's very interesting. I think that the location where the homestead is interesting because everything is symbolic. There are 56 steps up to the building that holds the cabin because he was 56 when he was killed. There's just all kinds of there are 13 columns. I'm sorry, 16 columns because he was the 16th president. The windows, everything has symbolism. And I think that it's really fascinating that they go to such detail there. But we talked about his patents. He obviously is a great mind. So many people often, associate Abraham Lincoln with Illinois, but of course, as a Kentuckian, we claim him as a Kentuckian. And while he was the senator from Illinois, he was born here and he grew up his early childhood days in Kentucky. Madeline McDowell Breckinridge is another, I think, that is important and sometimes overlooked. She is the granddaughter of Henry Clay, and she grew up at Ashland in Lexington. So great minds in that family and so many things that she ended up being influenced by. And I think that it's important to say here that she came from a family of wealth and privilege. And so a lot of what she was able to do was rooted in the fact that she was set up in a very good space. She was a huge person influential in the women's suffrage movement. She was married to the editor of the Lexington Herald, and she used that platform a lot to influence people. But she also was just a great advocate for social reform, for child labor laws, school attendance, for women's rights. She voted in the 1920 presidential election, which was the very first election following the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote. But she had a huge influence, and it came, like I said, outside of Kentucky. She used her ties that she had met through her grandfather, Henry Clay. And she was able to really have just a long-lasting impact. And I think that it's important to note when these women have impacts on the state, because so far, as you've noticed, it's a little bit of a man's game in the early days. And so introducing Madeline Breckinridge, I think, is important to learn that her influence really shed a positive light on Kentucky and her upbringing, which is what makes it important to me to include her as a hero. So much of what she did was progressive for women, but it was also progressive for the state of Kentucky, which we don't always think of as a progressive space. Meriwether Lewis Clark is on here. So this kind of turns a corner in what I'm considering politicians and social leaders. He's a funny person to include on this list because the reason I have him is because he is the founder of the Kentucky Derby. Now, you might not necessarily think that this makes him a social leader, or it certainly doesn't make him a politician. But what he did was bring horse racing to the state of Kentucky. So we're turning a corner and we're talking about, into a little bit later part of Kentucky history. But Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. was the grandson of William Clark of Lewis and Clark Expedition fame. And so he's named for both of the explorers. And he came to Kentucky to live with his mother's family when she died. And his uncles, who were the Churchill family, they gifted him about 300 acres of land outside of Louisville. And when they did so, he decided that he was going to bring a modern day way to bet and bring in money that wasn't the sort of sordid ways of the past. And he wanted to bring the influence of all the travel he had done in Great Britain, and he had seen all of this great horse racing and all the success there. And there, it was a classy event. Horse racing, you got dressed up and you went to the races, and children were welcome and women were welcome. And it wasn't this sort of seedy back road sort of situation. So he did a lot of traveling across Europe in the 1870s. He visited England's Epsom Downs. He watched lots of Derby stakes, and he came back and he went to his female friends across Louisville and he said, I want to get dressed up and I want to have a horse race. And so, we kind of downplay the importance of what fashion and things had, but really by setting that tone of only inviting well-to-do friends and dressing everybody up, He brought a classy event to the state of Kentucky, and with it, an incredible industry that ended up funding and advancing the state well into where we are today. So I include him on this list because he was in charge of running that first Kentucky Derby. More than 10,000 people attended, so it worked. The first race was ran in 1875, and with the exception of a couple of years, one during a war and one during a pandemic, we've run it every year since then. So obviously extremely influential. And I included Shirley May Beard on this list because I included Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. So Shirley May Beard is one of the very few people still alive on my list of Kentucky heroes that I have for you today. But Shirley May Beard, in 1988, opened a restaurant in Smoketown in Louisville, which is Louisville's first African-American community. And Shirley May's Cafe and Bar is still open today. And in 1989, the next year, she started having a salute to Black jockeys. And it was a party every year that coincided with the Derby Festival in Louisville. Now, Derby Festival in Louisville is a huge event, and if anyone's ever been, you know that it's more than just a horse race. In fact, that's just like an afterthought. It brings a lot of attention to our state. It brings a lot of industry to our state and involves nearly every aspect, tourism and food and agriculture, all these different aspects, but none of it really pays enough attention to the incredible impact that Black jockeys and Black trainers had on the Kentucky Derby and its success. I want to give credit to Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., but I also want to say that none of that was possible without the work of these Black jockeys. So Shirley May celebrated that work. In the first Kentucky Derby, 13 of the 15 riders were Black men. The winner was a Black man. He was trained, the winning horse was trained by a Black man. And most of those horses were trained and rode and raced and won by former slaves who were now, at the time owned. And so I think it's important to note that Shirley was bringing attention to those people. She does not anymore have that celebration every year, but they do lots of other activities in Louisville around the Derby Festival today that were inspired by Shirley May Beard's impact and her desire to bring interest to that part of the story. All right, questions so far? I think I might even be getting faster as I go. Slow me down at any time.
I will. No questions, but people are saying things like, "Oh, I didn't know that," or "Good stuff." So keep on going.
Good. Keep it. That's right. Keep the compliments going. I won't lose steam. No, authors and journalists. There are so many, both historic and modern people that we could talk about here. Some of the ones not included in these few comments will be Barbara Kingsolver, Bobby M. Mason, Sue Grafton, Wendell Berry. There's a ton of authors still alive today, still working today that I still read about. Silas House, Crystal Wilkinson. These are great folks. I recommend recommending your friends and family and students to read Kentucky authors. They come from diverse places. And if I can reiterate anything about me traveling the state and talking to you about Kentucky, it's that this is my version of Kentucky. And it took me a little bit of time to acknowledge that personally. And probably even longer to acknowledge it professionally. But I've been lucky enough to travel across the state and talk about the Kentucky I know, the Kentucky I explored with my family, the Kentucky that I have gotten to know through my interactions and my friends and my travels. But this is just my version of the state and my very kind of closed window to the state. So I like to try to always involve other people's views of the state and experiences with its history, which is certainly not without controversy or color. That being said, no better way to explore all those different viewpoints of Kentucky than through its authors and journalists, because they come from so many different places. And I think it's really important to talk about that. I'll start with Jesse Stewart. He was born in Greenup County. And the reason I like Jesse Stewart is because he was a really prolific author who wrote both fiction and nonfiction, poetry, short stories, all set in Central Appalachia, really inspired by Central Appalachia. But he was a teacher. He started as a teacher in Greenup County, and then he left into graduate school at Vanderbilt, and then he returned and he taught and he became a superintendent of Greenup County schools. And I just think that it's so amazing to think that he was doing such incredible work. He ended up being the poet laureate of Kentucky in 1954. And then he was just every day going and sitting up in front of a classroom, and he was teaching young people. And then later as a superintendent, really helping educators and young people. So Jesse Stewart is definitely always been an inspiration of mine, that he was able to just really take his roots of Kentucky and to teach other people about it. And not only did he teach Kentucky youth, and he's famous for teaching people to appreciate the state and teaching people to stay involved here, but he also was a big advocate for Appalachia to others, and to other educators. And he did a lot of work trying to get surrounding states to really learn more about the region and educate people about the Appalachian history, and culture and traditions and things. Thomas Merton is another favorite of mine. He is not a Kentuckian, not born here, but we will claim him. He was born in France, but he moved to the United States and into Kentucky, and he was actually received as they call them novices at a monastery in Kentucky in December 1941. So for those of you who have been to the Abbey of Gethsemane, that's where Thomas Merton was. If you have not been to the Abbey of Gethsemane, I recommend going. It doesn't matter if you're Catholic, it doesn't matter if you're religious, I still recommend going. It is a very beautiful grounds. It's an incredible place. It's also just a very unique travel experience if you have never been. It is silent. So once you arrive in the parking lot on the grounds, you are supposed to be silent. Now outside, that's a little loosey-goosey rule, and my husband definitely did not obey. But once you're inside the monastery itself, it's definitely no speaking. We were there for a service, watched the monks. It's an incredible experience, and I encourage folks to go. They do retreats and things for those who aren't interested in the religion. You can go for retreats. That some of them are silent, some of them are not. They have them for both men and women. They have them for couples as well. So I recommend at least visiting the Abbey of Gethsemane. For those of you who are into bourbon and like to do the Bourbon Trail, I promise there's a connection. It's right on the way to Maker's Mark. So you can stop on the way or the way back. It depending on how many bourbon tastings you have, you may want to stop on the way there and not on the way back from that trip. But I definitely recommend it. Thomas Merton became a Trappist monk, and he stayed at the Abbey of Gethsemane for the rest of his life once he started there in 1941. He eventually was ordained into the Catholic priesthood in 1949, and he was given the name Father Louis. And that is actually the name that's on his headstone there. So he's buried at the Abbey of Gethsemane in a very nondescript headstone. Doesn't even say Thomas Merton on it, it says Father Louis. But he was, a great writer of religion, but also social issues. He was one of the first Catholic priests to really take a lot of inspiration from Eastern religion. He did a lot of meditation. He was friends with the Dalai Lama, and he drew a lot of inspiration from the Dalai Lama. And so I think that he really, while being a devoted Catholic, he was a very modern way of thinking about theology and a very modern way of thinking about how that could apply to his life. And he certainly had a lot of writings about global politics and change in society, and once again brought a lot of attention to the space of Kentucky. Bell Hooks is another one that I hope you all have heard of. Bell Hooks is her pen name. She was born Gloria Jean Watkins in Hopkinsville, and her pen name honors her mother and her mother's mother. And I don't have a typo here. She purposely leaves her name lowercase. She said she left her pen name lowercase so that she could bring attention to her work and her social issues and not focus on something superficial like a name. But she was a brilliant writer, died recently. She actually was working on her PhD in California when her first book, Ain't I a Woman, was published, and it became sort of a breakthrough. She was an African-American writer, and there weren't a lot like her, and it was a huge feat for her. She ended up writing 30 books, lots of scholarly articles, speeches, dedications. She ended up moving back to Kentucky and teaching at Berea College. But she was really a trailblazer for so many in that field of writing personal stories, of writing not just about her heritage, but also just about her experience in Kentucky. She certainly had lots of information about battles of race and gender equity, and she was bringing in all of that and how living in rural Kentucky made extra challenges for those groups. And so her work is really inspirational. I recommend it to everyone. And in the same breath, I will talk about Alice Dunnigan. So Alice Dunnigan is sort of an unsung hero that I like to bring to people's attention. She was the first African-American woman to serve in the White House press corps. And she was born here in Kentucky, in Russellville in 1906. She wrote for a newspaper in Owensboro for a while. And then she started writing for school teachers. She would do supplemental materials to textbooks that were like the African-American contribution to these events. So she would collect all this information about influential Black Kentuckians, and she would supplement textbooks that were in circulation at the time, which of course did not mention these African-American contributions. And so those were later all collected, and they're together in a bind now called The Fascinating Story of Black Kentuckians. And you get that now as this incredible publication of history and people in Kentucky that were otherwise sort of unknown and unwritten about. And so it's a huge contribution. She moved to DC before World War II, and she began working as a reporter. She worked in Chicago, she worked for the Associated Negro Press, and then she got on with the White House Press Corps. She was the first female granted a congressional press pass. And she reported on the campaigns of Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower during the Civil Rights Movement, which is just an incredibly iconic time, and she was a great journalist. This photo is of her holding a copy of the Washington Post on the steps of the United States Capitol. And there was a local artist named Amanda who did a great statue in copper of her that has kind of made the tour around Kentucky. It was at Kentucky State University for a while. It was here at the Capitol in Frankfort for a while. And now it is in a community garden in Russellville. If you're ever in Russellville, stop and see it. It's a great work of art, and it's a great commemoration of the life of Alice Dunnigan. I throw Hunter S. Thompson on this list because you feel like you can't not mention Hunter S. Thompson. Very different from the other writers on this list. No less inspirational, but very different. Born in Louisville, his mother was the head librarian at the Louisville Free Public Library. And Hunter S. Thompson is colorful, to say it lightly. Perhaps most famous for Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which he wrote in 1971. And for being credited for inventing gonzo journalism. So gonzo journalism is a style of journalism where you don't claim to be impartial. You don't claim to not have an opinion. You don't claim to not be given a commentary on what you're writing about, but it doesn't mean you're not covering it anyway. The first example of this was in the Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved, which he wrote and published in 1970, I'm sorry. And it kind of went on to be this very interesting style that led through the 70s and was popular until the mid 80s. And so I want to throw him in and tell you, if you have not read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, not watched the movie, read the book, you should. I won't promise you'll like it, but I think that it's something that you should read, knowing that he was born in Louisville and comes from that Kentucky background. I am on the last part, so I'm going to take a deep breath, check and see if anybody has questions so far before we finish out with athletes and entertainers.
Yeah, still no questions.
Okay.
Glad to see Jean Ritchie on the screen too. That's great.
Yes. Kentucky musicians are so many different genres. I think people automatically go to bluegrass music when we think about Kentucky music. But truthfully, there are influences in jazz and hip hop and country music and bluegrass music and all the above in different works of Kentucky. So I do have Jean Ritchie in here and to talk about her first. One of the things I like to think about when I think about people kind of moving into Kentucky and coming across the Appalachian Mountains is, how would one carry like a guitar or a banjo or some sort of musical instrument along this journey? And I'm not talking about on horseback with Daniel Boone. Well, fast forward a little bit, but still, even in a covered wagon or in a carriage or anything, you know, we couldn't really carry instruments through the Appalachian Mountains and move them from the coast over into Kentucky. So the mountain dulcimer, if you've ever seen one, and Jean Ritchie is holding one there in her lap, and it's kind of cut off on that photo, but it was a small instrument that people could make and play, and it had lots of different unique sounds, and you could pluck it, or you could slide it, or you could do lots of things with it. And so it became very, very popular in early settlers who came to Kentucky. Its sweet plucked tones are very distinctive to Appalachian music, so you hear them a lot And you'll come to recognize that sound of that dulcimer and a lot of that. Jean Ritchie was born in Perry County, and she really mastered the dulcimer and she popularized it. She learned to make more complicated sounds with it, and she began writing music with her family. She not only wrote music and performed music, but she collected music, which is, I think, maybe one of her most important contributions to music in Kentucky, is that she would go around to her neighbors and to other folks in her community, and she would collect their songs and she would document them and she would write them down. And so we have a great knowledge of early Appalachian music thanks to Jean Ritchie's work. She was one of 14 children, and she was in a singing group with her family. Were called the Singing Ritchies, and they traveled around the area performing with her family and playing music. When she got a little bit older and she got married, she and her husband actually opened a little shop near the Hyman Settlement School, and they made dulcimers. And what they would do is they would build them and then they would leave them unfinished and they would ship them to a place in Brooklyn, and then they would be finished there in Brooklyn. And so there were lots of folks who ended up getting their hands on these dulcimers that Jean Ritchie built. Bob Dylan has long credited Jean Ritchie as one of his influences. There are songs that she wrote that have been performed by Johnny Cash and Leonard Ronstadt and Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harris. So she continues to have a lasting impact on music. Similarly, I can't really talk about music in Kentucky without talking about Bill Monroe, who is known as the father of bluegrass music, which, as a note, I should tell you, bluegrass music is not named for the bluegrass state, which I like to think it is, but it is not. It was actually named for Bill Monroe's group, the Bluegrass Boys. And so maybe they were named for bluegrass in Kentucky, but of course, at that time, it was not really the bluegrass state yet. But father of bluegrass music, he was born in Ohio County. He has so many recognitions, it's hard to list them all. He's been inducted in the Country Music Hall of Fame, the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He has a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. He, no small potatoes. But he is most famous for his work with the Bluegrass Boys. He performed a lot at the Grand Ole Opry. Perhaps his most famous song is Blue Moon of Kentucky, which became a huge pop hit when Elvis recorded it. But it's also been covered by Patsy Cline and Paul McCartney. So you should all check out those versions as well. And I'll mention Loretta Lynn in the same breath because everyone knows the coal miner from Butcher Holler. Born in Butcher Holler and always proud of that history and where she came from. I think that she brought a lot of attention to the conditions of Kentucky at the time and really gave a voice to a lot of people who were in coal mining towns and who were growing up in maybe poorer situations. And I think that she got out and she showed them that she still honored them and that she showed them that she brought them a lot of hope. And I think that it's important to talk about her. I don't have the Judds on this list, but similarly, the Judds are also that same category. Loretta Lynn had 60 albums, 160 songs, 10 albums on #1, 16 singles at #1. I mean, hugely impactful. And I think that, like I said, a lasting influence on females in that genre. She was the first woman to have a #1 hit written in country music. It was "You Ain't Woman Enough to Take My Man." So like I said, I can't talk about music in Kentucky or entertainers in Kentucky without mentioning Loretta Lynn. I also bring up the Clooneys, mostly just because I like to talk about the Clooneys. We know George maybe the most, but really, if you think about Kentucky and impactful Kentuckians, Rosemary Clooney was huge. She was born in Maysville and did a lot of work there, even as she became famous for being in White Christmas and several other movies. She also is famous for singing Pennies in Heaven. And if you visit her grave in Northern Kentucky, people will leave pennies on her headstone, which is, I think, a very lovely tradition. Her brother Nick was also a very famous journalist in Northern Kentucky and in Cincinnati. So I put him on this list as well. I have Muhammad Ali on here because I feel like probably the most famous athlete, maybe one of the most famous people from Kentucky is Muhammad Ali. He was born in Louisville in 1942 as Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., so not Muhammad Ali at birth. Often called the greatest for a reason, probably one of the most impactful people on boxing. And won an Olympic gold medal when he was 18 at the 1960 Summer Olympics. and then turned professional later that year. Now, he became famous also for his social activism, which sometimes overshadowed his boxing success. So I wanted to start with boxing success. But he became a great opponent, I will call it opponent politely, a great opponent of the Vietnam War. And he often spoke out against it. He was drafted and denied going and refused to go when he was drafted because of religious reasons. At that time, he had converted and he was a Muslim. He changed his name. His main motivation for changing his name was he said that he had a slave name and he wanted to rid himself of that. And so he wanted to embrace his new Muslim identity and change his name to Muhammad Ali. So he claimed religious reasons and just general social discourse for not wanting to go support the war in Vietnam. And he was actually found guilty of dodging the draft. Now, that decision was overturned by the Supreme Court, and so all of those convictions were stripped, and he returned to boxing. But during that time, it was 4 years where he was under investigation. He didn't box, and he lost a lot of time there in his professional career. And he often talked about how much was lost there and how much he would be, how much greater he would be, which I can't imagine what he thought about how much greater he could be. In 1999, Sports Illustrated named him the Sportsman of the Century, and I think that that's probably very true. An incredible presence in Louisville, very respected in Louisville. If anyone remembers when he passed away a few years ago and they had a huge funeral for him there, it was an incredible thing to watch. So I say a few years ago, it's been longer than that now. My few years is very loosely translated to, it could be 2, it could also be 18, you never know. And I'll close with Happy Chandler. And I purposely put A.B. Chandler, most commonly known as Happy Chandler, on this list and not the political list. And many of you may think I'm crazy, which by now we probably know is true or not true. But Happy Chandler was the 44th and 49th governor of Kentucky. He was also a U.S. Senator representing Kentucky and a very influential politician in our state. But he also served as second commissioner of baseball, and he's been inducted in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So a lot of people don't know about his career in baseball. He attended Transy. He was a multi-sport athlete at Transy, and he did briefly consider going pro and being a pro baseball player. But the reason I have him on this list, because he did not, in fact, go pro, and it's not necessarily a famous Kentucky athlete, is because a lot of folks don't realize that he was instrumental during the 1947 season in signing the contract of Jackie Robinson with the Montreal Royals. I couldn't think of this location, the Royals, the Montreal Royals. And he was became the first African-American baseball player to play Major League. Now, Happy Chandler was commissioner during this time, so he could have vetoed that contract and he could have shut it all down. But he was part of the meetings all along with the management from the Brooklyn Dodgers about getting this contract for Jackie Robinson. And behind the scenes, he was working with those coaches and really paving the way for bringing African-American athletes into the sport. So he wasn't really vocal about it, and it wasn't until later in his career he even talked about it. So I always like to include him on these lists as an athlete as well as a politician, because often his politics overshadowed the work that he did in the world of Major League Baseball and all the integration and things that he moved towards. Now I'm going to take a long breath and have a minute. I finished just barely under the wire, and I certainly don't want to keep you all night, but I want to answer any questions you might have. I will do my best to answer questions you have and give you an opportunity to have me clarify or tell me I'm wrong about things. Or if you want to be like the 5th graders, we can just talk about chickens as well. I'm also happy to give you travel tips or destinations you should go to, whatever you'd like in a minute or so.
One thing I want to point out is Jennifer Chandler just said her husband's grandfather's name was Happy Chandler, but not the same one.
Well, you don't have to tell people not the same one. You could just tell them that it is the same one.
Is that picture you're showing there taken from Daniel Boone's grave?
It is. So I wanted to note that when we first moved to Frankfort 8 years ago, I grew up in Lexington. We moved to Frankfort 8 years ago. We used to go up to the cemetery all the time so my husband could take photos of the Capitol. And I have to say, lately, I have been relying on them a lot, because if you've been to Frankfort lately, you know that the dome is completely covered in scaffolding because they're restoring it, and will likely be that way for a little while. So I'm relying on these pictures from a couple of years ago to remind me that it actually is beautiful. And one day my view out my window will be bigger than it is right now.
Yes. I lived in Frankfurt for a few years myself and really enjoyed it. And I recognize that spot very well.
Yeah, it's very famous. Great. I always tell people it's weird to say visit cemeteries, but visit cemeteries.
Yeah.
Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville is one of the most incredible cemeteries I've ever been to. Lots of famous people buried there. The Frankfurt Cemetery has the best views of the city and the capital. It's absolutely beautiful up there. So I always tell people, go to the cemetery, walk around. Never know what you'll see.
The other Happy Chandler's grandson's wife has a question. Jennifer Chandler said, is there anything else you would recommend close to Abraham Lincoln's birthplace for a day trip?
Yeah, so actually Abraham Lincoln's birthplace in Hodgensville, it's a great space to go if you're going to go to so you can go to Big Bone Lick, you can go to Maker's Mark Distillery, you can go to the Abbey of Gethsemane. Those are all right there. I always take, from where I am in Frankfurt, I always take Bluegrass Parkway and head that way. And so before you get to where you need to exit for Hodgensville and Abraham Lincoln's place, you also pass Bardstown. So if it's a little bit extra time and you'd have to start in the morning to be able to fit it all in, but you'll actually, to get to my old Kentucky home off the Bardstown exit on Bluegrass Parkway, it's like a couple minutes. So you could do, of course, there's all the bourbon stuff in Bardstown, but my old Kentucky home, and it would be on your way to Hodgensville. Now that's, of course, if you're coming from where I'm coming from, it may not necessarily be coming from that direction. But those, and I would also say go to there are two destinations for Abraham Lincoln, and they are maybe 20 minutes from one another. So you'll go to both, like the actual birthplace and then the boyhood home, and they're very easy to get to. You actually pass one going to the other. So I would do both of those.
And Bardstown itself, is this a great
Oh
place?
yes, I mean Bardstown's incredible. It's beautiful.
Thanks for the question, Jennifer. Anybody else have a question? You'll also see while you're thinking that Blair has her email and other connections there. So check her out.
I put those up because, I mean, like I said, I meet lots of people traveling around doing this. I obviously prefer to meet all of you in person, but this works too. For years later, I will get random emails from people that are like, we met this one place. I have family coming in from Colorado and I'm just wondering where I should take them. And those, I get so excited to get notes like that. I started not as a Kentucky historian or a Kentucky researcher. I started as a traveler. I really wanted to get out and explore Kentucky and get other people to do the same. So I always tell people when I wrote those travel books, I wasn't a traveler or an author who traveled. I was a traveler who wrote books. So any recommendations, I have been so many places. I have been to all 120 counties. Can't really say there's something to do in all of them, but I'm sure there is. But I love to give travel recommendations. I love to give my good and bad experiences, places. I've been lots of places twice, 3 times, 6 times. So please feel free to reach out. It doesn't bother me at all. I probably will be too enthusiastic about responding to you.
So in Hopkinsville, I guess it's Hopkinsville. Is that the Jefferson Davis Memorial? Is that what they call it?
Yeah, it's just outside of Hopkinsville. It's in Falmouth. It's a monument. So it looks just like the Washington Monument in DC, shorter. I have climbed it, have been to the top.
I have climbed it.
Great views from up there. It's an interesting place. I went most recently in 2018 when the eclipse was in you could best see it from Western Kentucky. We went down for the eclipse and we stopped there on the way home. And it's a beautiful place. And there's lots of great history, lots of interesting history. My thing is always, I like to go and read the history. I like to learn from the people. You can disagree with everything there. You can passionately disagree with everything Jefferson Davis stood for. I think it's still important to learn the history because we learn from it if we do it well. And so I don't necessarily think shouldn't go just because I don't think it says you're a fan of Jefferson Davis if you go to the monument.
Right. Well, I was just
you're a fan of the history.
Yeah, it was one of those spots as I was driving to that I thought, wow, what is that off in the distance on this kind of country road. It's kind of
Stands
an
out pretty
interesting spot.
predominantly. Yeah, it's very
Definitely,
interesting.
definitely. You all are definitely free to go, of course. I did put the evaluation link in the chat box, but if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask. We'll take just a minute or two. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.